I call this meeting back to order. Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. This is of meeting number 32 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence, which started on Friday, May the 21st, 2021. Please, if at any time interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately and we will ensure that interpretation is back up and operating before we can continue. It's important that everyone have an opportunity to fully participate in these proceedings. A reminder that all, I have to put this on silent, sorry, because I think it hurts the interpreter's ears. Please speak slowly and clearly, and I will try to do exactly the same things for our good interpreters. And with regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do the best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they're participating virtually or in person. So we are resuming debate on Mr. Bagnall's amendment to Mr. Bazan's motion, and Madame Vanderbilt had the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do believe that at the last meeting, I left off by going through some of the recommendations, the very important recommendations that survivors have presented to us either through testimony or through testimony at FUO or directly. And I just want to start by saying, Madam Chair, that I do wish that we actually had agreement by the opposition to adjourn debate so that we could immediately get to the reports. There's three very important reports that I think would be very important for us to go to directly to considering drafting. I know that the opposition, what we're debating right now is an amendment that asks that we have a government response. And I again reiterate that I don't see the purpose of having reports and then not asking the government to respond to those reports. So as a result, we're still here. And I will then continue discussing these important recommendations so that at least we can get these recommendations on the record, because I think that it is very important. And then, we will do our best to ensure that that there's action taken on these. But there's a tremendous amount of effort and work that survivors go through, and experts that went through when they came to speak at our committee. When somebody comes to be a witness, we forget because we're here as members of Parliament and we're used to being in a committee room, we're used to speaking, but for somebody who, especially somebody who's survived a sexual trauma, or for people who have spent their lives as academics studying an issue, to come to Parliament and be asked to speak before a parliamentary committee, to give their testimony, to answer questions, is a big deal, and it matters, and a lot of preparation goes into that. And I would point at people like Professor Maya Eichler, who, when she came here, she had her 10 minutes to be able to present, and this is a professor who has literally devoted her academic writings and her academic study on the Canadian Armed Forces and military and culture and gender and all of these issues. She had a tremendous amount to provide to this committee. But instead of allowing us to ask questions and be able to have the interaction back and forth with her, again, there were games played, there were motions coming forward, and all she had was her 10 minutes. Now, I would very much like to make sure that some of the testimony and also things that witnesses and survivors and experts have provided is actually at least provided on the record right here, that will be enhanced and is official by reading them out. So I do believe that I ended on the recommendation about that self-monitoring is too reactive and inconsistent for the complex problem of sexual violence. I'll go to the next recommendation, which recommends addressing the use of sexually and racially coded language, which supports and accentuates social hierarchies in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think this one is very important, and it does go to quite a bit of the testimony that we heard. And I spoke a little bit the other day about how these social hierarchies are established. It's rarely blunt. It's rarely through, it does happen, but it's rarely that somebody turns to somebody else, points at them and says, "You do not belong," or makes an overt kind of a comment that would indicate that that person does not belong, that that person is othered, that they are different. They do it through coded language. And I do think that it's interesting here that the survivors, when putting these recommendations forward, mentioned sexually and racially coded language, because we cannot distinguish. There are many people for whom intersectionality only duplicates and amplifies what they face. So women have always faced discrimination within institutions, including the military. If you are a transgender woman, you will face even more discrimination. If you are racialized, Black, Indigenous, and a woman, and so we add these layers of identity. And I think we can't necessarily distinguish, because when people are choosing who belongs and who does not, and we heard from some of the witnesses the idea that there is a masculine normative toxic culture that essentially says it's the warrior concept. It's this idea that to be and I mentioned this previously, good soldier, a good aviator, a good sailor, that there is a particular typecast that is assumed to be a good soldier. And a lot of this is based in a very, very not modern way of looking at military. We know that in the military, there are occupations across the board. There are occupations. I mean, even I had the wonderful opportunity, I think it was 3 years ago, to be able to sail on the HMCS Winnipeg, and we went from San Francisco to Esquimalt through the leadership program, and this is something all members of Parliament are entitled to and allowed to participate in. It's a wonderful way to get to know the day-to-day life of our sailors who are doing tremendous, tremendous work, and to really understand what that's like. And I can tell you that experience, it was 3 nights. It was 3 nights on a ship, and very few people get to experience what might life have been had I chosen a different path. And for 3 nights, I got to see firsthand, had I made a different choice in my life, had I chosen to go into the military, to join the Navy, what would it have been? What would it have been like? And it gave me a level of understanding, just sleeping in the bunk on the ship, and eating in the with the sailors, and sitting down and talking and listening to them. And I talked to women who were on that ship they were just returning home. They'd been on the ship for 6 months, and being away from your family, being away from your children, the sacrifices that they make, but also the incredible sense of unity and camaraderie. And there's a recommendation coming up that talks about group loyalty, and I think that this is one of the things that makes it so hard when that's betrayed. And I could see the close quarters. I could see that if somebody were in a situation where they were being sexually harassed, you can't avoid people on a ship. And it really made a difference, when we were sitting and talking, different people and different ways of minimizing or diminishing or building up and building team and leadership, it can affect the entire group. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the other experiences that I had while on the HMCS Winnipeg, and the people that I met there, and how profoundly impressed I was about that, because we were able to see, we were able to participate in fire drills. We were able to participate in rescues if there was somebody who was overboard. We were able to participate in, in many of the activities, the day-to-day activities. We saw the engine room. We saw the the operations room. We did a simulated attack where we actually experienced and saw what it would be like if the ship was hit by a torpedo, and everything from where the table in the dining room turns into a surgical table, the multiple uses for the space, because space is very limited. And it was really an incredibly eye-opening experience that showed me that there are so many trades, there are so many ways to serve, that isn't what you see on TV. that isn't what we see in pop culture. You know, this, and again, I reiterate this World War I notion of, you know, the soldier in the trench. There's so much more in today's military, and yet the way in which the typecast, the normative of who will succeed, it is still very much masculine, heterosexual, normative kind of a way of looking at it. And frankly, that is doing a disservice, because it actually takes away this number of skill sets, men and women. And I do think that it is very important to note that if there's a toxic masculinity that only favors a certain kind of masculinity over others, this is just as limiting and damaging to men that don't fit the typecast as it is to women. But I go back to the recommendation here that talks about sexually and racially coded language, because I can only imagine in an environment like that, when there are microaggressions, when there are comments made, and they can be very subtle comments, but they are ways in which people within the group navigate. And I think we've all experienced it. I imagine that, you know, anybody who is racialized, or a woman, or Indigenous, or LGBT, or anybody that has an identity that isn't part of the norm or normative of the group that they're in, has experienced this kind of thing. I've certainly seen it in politics, where there are things that are, and when I like the fact that it says coded, because it is coded. It is a signal that somebody sends to someone else to say, that person is different, that person is othered, that person does not belong here. And it's a way in which to create the social hierarchies that Dr. Okros and others spoke to us and provided testimony about. And sometimes I think people don't even realize they're doing it. We hear things said and we repeat them. And I think sometimes it is, especially for those that are in the dominant group, they may not even realize when they're using certain language, when they're using certain terms that have become so frequent, the harm and the impact that actually might have on other people in the group, who then are being told, not outright, but they're being told day by day, through small little things, through microaggressions, through the words that are used, through the choice of terms. They're told, you don't belong here, you're not part of the group. And I've heard from some of the survivors that can be even more damaging, that constant, over time, piling on of these microaggressions and the language and the things that make you feel like you don't belong, in a place that you've committed your life to, something you believe in thoroughly. And that's where the sense of betrayal, I think, comes in, because you have people who believe profoundly in the group in which they are, what they're part of, what the objective is, the protection of Canadians, the protection, the bringing of peace and security in the world. You know, and going back to what I learned when I was on the Winnipeg, the work that they're doing. I mean, they've intercepted drugs in the Caribbean. They've intercepted pirates in off the coast of Somalia. They have participated in multi-country efforts to make sure that we are safe, that we are secure on so many levels, on things that we wouldn't even know about. And honestly, I think we should probably talk more about some of the successes that our military, you know, the things that they do that make our day-to-day lives safer. I don't think that people who have a family member who's struggling with drug addiction realize how many drugs are intercepted and stopped from getting here, either to North America, to Canada, because of the military. And that's something that, you know, when we look at young people thinking about their career, and, you know, I was talking to a young woman who, you know, her brother is an addict, and she has had real difficulties with that. And she said, I want to be a social worker because I want to make a difference. And I want to make sure that other people don't become addicts, that they have services. And that is wonderful. I think that giving back, that young woman wants to be a social worker. But would she have ever even thought that perhaps if she joined the Navy, that might actually be another way to stop the drugs from getting here and stop things like what was happening with her brother. I don't know if she would have thought of that as a way of giving back, because we don't know the stories. We don't know all of the different things that the military does. And part of that is because of this stereotype. You know, when you watch TV, you look at a lot of the shows that portray military, and I'll confess, I watch a lot of them myself, and this is a genre that I quite like. But just like I asked a friend of mine who's a doctor, I've watched 11 seasons of Grey's Anatomy. Does that make me qualified? And she said, it certainly doesn't make you qualified to be a doctor, but anyway, she made a joke, but I'm not going to repeat. But the same thing with political shows. We all know that when we watch these political shows, they don't reflect the reality of what it is to be an elected member of parliament. The same way, I think a lot of the shows and pop culture that portrays a life in the military is not a full picture of what life in the military is. And you do see in pop culture this racially and sexually coded language. You do see a lot of the stereotypes. You do see, and I think, Hollywood is getting better at trying to show a little bit more. I noted in I tend to watch SEAL Team, and I noted that recently they dealt on SEAL Team with an issue on a ship about sexual harassment. And they had one of the characters step in and speak out for somebody she herself had experienced, and then she saw it happening to someone else on the ship, and she stepped in and spoke out about it because she was an officer and had more power than she did at the time that this had happened to her. I'm talking about the fictional character now. And then you showed the backlash and the retaliation and some of the challenges that they had, and the fact that when more women spoke out, when the first one spoke out, when somebody who had some power at that point, an officer, defended somebody who didn't have power, who was more junior, and they faced a backlash, other women spoke out. And because of that, in that show anyway, it started to make a difference. And they've dealt, I think, with other issues as well. But I think that you're only now seeing that, and you're seeing it because it's reflecting what is really happening. But for a lot of the pop culture, for a lot of what we see, when children look at, what do I want to be when I grow up, and they look at soldiers and they look at TV and Hollywood. I don't think that it is completely, it's not inclusive. It's getting better, like I gave the example in the show SEAL Team, where they are actually, SEAL Team is also, I noticed, trying to deal with issues about PTSD as well, and veterans. And I think that's a good thing. But it's very recent that Hollywood is starting to portray some of these issues that really happen. I think that it is really still the norm in our mindset, which is why the sexually and racially coded language, the social hierarchies, the portrayal of military in only a very aggressive, masculine warrior kind of a way, where leadership, as we know, is much broader than that. That's not to say that you don't need those skill sets, but it is to say that we need to see it a lot more broadly. And so that's why I think that particular recommendation is so important. But I do see that there are many other hands up, so I will allow my colleagues to have a say before I come back and go through some of the other recommendations. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair. And I wanted to speak because I wanted to return to the focus of what I think Mr. Bagnall's amendment is designed to achieve, which is, it's clearly suggests that we should at the very least ask you for a government response to the report that this committee produces. And I wanted to speak to some of the reasons I think that's important. One of the things that I think is critical in light of the challenge facing the armed forces is making sure that not just good ideas come forward, but that good ideas in terms of or solutions get proposed, but that they get acted upon. And the requiring a government response is something that allows that helps ensure that the legislators like us, when we put forward those recommendations, those solutions to problems that we are trying to tackle, actually, government has a responsibility to indicate to us and to Canadians how they plan to proceed on those. And so I think it's important that we hold this government, future governments, to account on their actions on this issue. I think, in my view, one of the reasons, I mean, this is a long-standing, I think we all know this, it's a long-standing problem, that the problem of sexual harassment, sexual assault in the military. It's transcended government after government. And the reality is that during that period, there are a lot of reasons why this has happened, but during that period of time, there have been many good ideas brought forward, and many people who've advocated, and many people many survivors who've courageously spoken up to alert people to the problem and to try to solve the problem. And of course, there are many reasons why this issue has not been addressed, and why it has not been solved. But one of them is, I think, because we need to make sure that this is signaled as a priority by MPs of all stripes and to the government of the day, whichever government happens to be in power. And so when I think about this report, which is our way to convey our advocacy, or to convey our point of view, to resolve the issues, try to resolve the issue of sexual harassment, sexual assault before us. This is our primary tool as a committee. And I think it's powerful, especially if it comes from the committee itself and all members of the committee. And we worked a consensus to write that report. I think it could have a powerful impact. And so, but I think that aside for a moment, making sure that the government actually responds to it, I think is incredibly important, because it's the government's response that is what we can know what we can expect from government. B, we can signal if we disagree with what government is doing, and C, we can hold government to account for its actions against its own stated intention when it responds to our report. So I wanted to reinforce how important I think Mr. Bagnall's amendment to Mr. Bazan's motion is. And I think when we, when the members of this committee will know that I've relied quite a bit during this debate on this amendment, on Mr. Bazan's motion, on the trying to do my best to give voice to the point of view of survivors, of victims, and I've done that both because I think it's helpful to refocus, or if need be, but certainly focus ourselves and others who are watching this and reading the transcripts and studying what we're debating here, on what it is we should be trying to solve, who it is we should be trying to help, who the people are who are suffering and going unhelped, and that's the victims of sexual harassment, sexual assault in the armed forces. So as you know, I've tried to do my best to give voice to those, to their points of view, and especially in the testimony that a number of survivors and experts have provided to the standing committee on the status of women. One of those people who I was speaking about in our prior meeting was Ms. Batek, who's a survivor, but also a representative, or testified to the Status of Women Committee as a representative of the Survivor Perspectives Consulting Group, which she referred to, and I'll refer to as SPCG. And SPCG was created by a small group of military sexual trauma survivors, and they've come together to help address this problem, to ensure survivor voices are heard, and to help create solutions. And in in our prior meeting, the members will likely recall that I read some of the testimony from the Ms. Batek provided to the Status of Women Committee in terms of the kinds of help that she and her colleagues could offer to government, to the military, to MPs, et cetera, in trying to tackle the problem. And I highlighted Ms. Batek's testimony for a number of reasons, but one of them was because I felt it was an excellent example of the type of perspective that we need in our report, in our work here on the Standing Committee of National Defense, that we need to hear those voices, which is why I'm giving them voice in this debate, but also that we need to take heed of their advice. And Ms. Batek alluded to a number of the complexities and of the issues that have to be tackled to stop sexual harassment, sexual assault in the military. And for me, it was I highlighted that because it was important that we take note of the work ahead and how complex this is and how much work is involved and how much expertise is needed to solve it and how the expertise of people like Ms. Batek and others, especially survivors, needs to be at the center of not just who we're trying to help, but whose help we need to solve this problem. And I think that and that is why I feel so strongly that we need to have a report that's written based on the consensus of members in this committee, like it would be, like reports are written at every committee on every issue, because we need to make sure that we do so. We speak with one voice. I think that's important, but also I think it's very important that we acknowledge that these issues are what's contributing to sexual assault and sexual harassment in the military. Is going to require our best. We're going to need to put our best foot forward to resolve it because it's complex, because it's nuanced, and because we need to understand that complexity, understand that nuance, and understand what has to be done. We need to we understand and bring into our report recommendations like those provided by Ms. Batek and her colleagues and other survivors. I wanted to just share with you something that Ms. Batek said in the last in her testimony to the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. She speaks to the impact of what's happening, and she says a sexualized military culture in many cases may lead to military domestic violence, child abuse, and civilian sexual assault. Not only does this culture provide a safe space for perpetrators to hide and exist under the protection of a uniform, but it also inadvertently teaches the victims to tolerate the intolerable, which leads to lives plagued with mental health challenges, potential homelessness, and future abusive relationships. The social cost of allowing this toxic culture to survive extends to the Canadian public, and that makes this a Canadian problem with real financial and social costs affecting all taxpayers. So I just wanted to pause there. I think one of the things, and rightly so, we focused our discussions, our debates on the impact that sexual assault and sexual harassment has on CAF members, and so we should. I think what Ms. Batek is raising is something that is very important to take note of, I think, and it should be one of those things that we should be considering as we're writing a report. And one of the reasons that Mr. Bagnall's motion is so important because getting a government response as to how it's going to address all elements of this problem and all impacts of this problem is important. And this is one of those. And in this particular case, Ms. Batek is speaking about how the sexualized military culture can lead to a whole series of issues outside of the military, most immediately in this case, for the family of the members of the armed forces who are impacted by the sexualized military culture. But when she talks about things like domestic violence, child abuse, and civilian sexual assault, I mean, folks, we can't just allow ourselves to. This committee can't allow itself, in my view, to just put out a report that ticks the box that allows us to say we wrote a report when it doesn't take into account this very issue, when we haven't thought and considered and debated and understood the nuance of how people, the families of CAF members, how others in civilian life are being impacted by what's happening in the military. We can't do that if each MP is only given 2 minutes to speak. That's just not realistic. It's taking me more than 2 minutes to just explain this problem, to convey Ms. Batek's point of view. So, her words, her concern about the social costs of this toxic culture surviving, extending to the Canadian public, I think, is something that we need to take heed of. And I think we need to make sure that our report and the government's response takes note of that and has solutions to address that. What those solutions are, we could debate. I have some thoughts on that. I'm sure members of the committee have thoughts about that, but that's the discussion we need to have. That's the consensus I think all of the members of this committee need to build if we're going to get to an outcome, to recommendations that are in the interest of survivors and in the interest of members of the Canadian public who are impacted in the way Ms. Batek is explaining. Ms. Batek goes on in her testimony and she says, when Lieutenant General Eyre testified before this committee on March 23rd, he explained that his approach to changing the sexualized military culture was based on 2 streams. The second of which included listening and learning. This is exactly where SPCG fits in. I just want to pause there for a second, because I think there's an important point to be noted from what Ms. Batek is saying. She highlights Lieutenant General Eyre's testimony before the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. I know that Lieutenant General Eyre testified here before us as well in this committee, but what she highlights and chose to underline in this particular testimony was that a key component of his approach was one of the 2 streams that he indicated was important, was listening and learning. And if that's something that Ms. Batek thought important to highlight in her testimony to the committee, I think it's worth underlining here too in this committee as we think about this motion by Mr. Bazan, the amendment proposed by Mr. Bagnall, by how we move forward. I think we need to listen and learn, and we need to apply that listening and learning. It's not okay for us to sit here and say we heard the witnesses and move on. And it's not okay to suggest that we shouldn't hear from the perspective of survivors. Quite the opposite. We should be listening and learning and then applying that. And if we just listen, if we don't listen, that is to me beyond reprehensible. If we just listen and we don't learn, then that too is to me, it is just unforgivable that we're not going to listen and learn and then act on what we've listened to and what we've learned. And I guess I'm going to urging members of the committee to do that. I think there are people like Ms. Batek who've testified before our colleagues who are urging us to do this, and who are offering their expertise and advice. I just think we need to make sure that we make use of that expertise and advice, and the only way we can do that as a committee is if we actually put it into our report and we get the government to respond to that, as Mr. Bagnall has urged us to do. Ms. Batek goes on. She says, after talking about the listening and learning, she says, this is exactly where SPCG fits in. Our team can provide the perspectives needed to ensure that every strategy, every plan, every policy, and every program aimed at tackling this crisis is viewed through a survivor-informed lens. I want to repeat that sentence. Our team can provide the perspectives needed to ensure that every strategy, every plan, every policy, and every program aimed at tackling this crisis is viewed through a survivor-informed lens. Is our work informed by a survivor-informed lens? Is it? I think if we're not willing to take the time to hear what the survivors have said, if we're not willing to take the time to understand, to learn from what they've said, if we're not willing to take the time to document what they've said and what they've advised government to do in a thoughtful way, and if we're not willing to do all of those things and then hold government to account to act on those things, then we're not taking a survivor-informed lens, and we're not tackling this crisis that the survivors have faced and so many other people are facing as we speak. So I share that just to say, let's take a survivor-informed lens. Let's make sure we take into account what they have to say, but to do that, and their advice, and their expertise, and their solutions, the solutions that they've brought forward, and others have brought forward, and let's write a fantastic report that we can be proud of, that Canadians can be proud of, most of all, that survivors can be proud of. Thanks very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. On to Mr. Spengeman, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning, colleagues. Good to be back for the continuation of our discussion. I'd like to just reinforce the view, which I think is shared by all members of the committee, that the perspective of victims has to be front and center. And victims have spoken in various fora, including the media and various parliamentary committees, and it is extremely important that their view is what governs our actions. Everything else is secondary, and I just wanted to reinforce the comments by my colleagues that have made with that in that direction with respect to that point. Next to the testimony of victims, following the testimony of victims, is testimony from experts, from policy leaders, from elected officials, from senior managers in our public service, from academics. And I've made the point, Madam Chair, also in previous interventions from other jurisdictions. I'll get back to that in a moment. But before I get into some more substance that will be helpful to the committee and its deliberations and its discussions, I just wanted to maybe take a moment to talk about partisanship. We're approaching the end of the parliamentary term. Partisan winds are blowing a bit more fiercely now than they were earlier in the year. But I think it's important that we keep an eye on what the purpose of a parliamentary committee is in its formulation, in its past history and its past achievements. And I've made reference to the achievements of this particular committee in the last parliament on diversity and inclusion in the armed forces, and also sexual misconduct in the armed forces in a previous report. Partisanship is an important part of who we are as elected officials. We belong to political parties, and in many respects, it's very valuable to our democratic process to have different ways of looking at different problems, and to make partisan points when appropriate. This particular issue, Madam Chair, calls for as unified an approach as we can possibly reach, because of its long-standing nature, because of its impact, its harmful impact on current and former serving members of the Canadian Forces and on the Canadian public at large, victimizing, re-victimizing. This needs to stop. It needs to stop urgently, and it can only stop if we unify ourselves to the greatest possible extent. And in that respect, maybe just a suggestion to colleagues. I mean, we have the House of Commons, and as Canadians will know when they watch Question Period, things will get partisan in the House, and they historically have, and they should, to the extent that partisan division is a useful way of highlighting problems, identifying different approaches, and giving Canadians a choice in terms of which approach they should follow. But perhaps we can arrive at a conclusion that partisan energies are best directed to the House at large, and this committee and other committees like it really should take a less partisan approach, should try to take the important testimony of victims, of experts, of elected officials, of others, and try to get to the same side of the table, facing the problem, solving the problem. It may not always work out, but to the greatest extent that we can, we should be nonpartisan in our orientation. And I'm hoping that even with the few remaining sessions that we have left, maybe that this thought may bear fruit, and that we can get to a place where we can make some progress in a manner that's unified as we possibly can. Madam Chair, I'd like to just briefly take a moment of my time now this morning to bring the committee to A report that I've mentioned, we've had the benefit of the UK experience, as I've mentioned, and particularly helpful to the committee is the fact that the UK, in fairly short order, not only conducted a review of sexual misconduct and other inappropriate behaviour in the UK Armed Forces in 2019 that I've referred to as the Wixton Report, commissioned or conducted by Air Chief Marshal Sir Michael Wixton, but then in fairly short order, within a year, went through an implementation and review process, and that process led to a progress review that is published entitled "Unacceptable Behaviors." And I just wanted to highlight to members of the committee some elements from that report, and I do that for three reasons, Madam Chair. The first reason, and I've said this before, is that this issue of sexual misconduct in Canadian, in forces, in armed forces like Canada's that are subject to democratic control, that are often working in alliances, be it NATO, be it UN peace operations, are encountering this problem with the same intensity, with the same seriousness and severity, and are taking action right about the same time as we are. And there's some cross-references in that work to the Canadian experience back and forth. So that's reason one. It isn't just a Canadian problem. It is a multinational, not an international problem, but certainly a multinational problem. And it affects not only, it's relevant not only to the moral component in the sense that sexual misconduct clearly is wrong no matter where it occurs, but it also affects the operational effectiveness of alliances like NATO and UN peace missions and peace operations. The second point is that I'm raising these experiences in part to encourage the committee to move forward. As my colleague Mr. Baker and others in past interventions have said, it's really time to see if we can come together around some key recommendations. The message simply is, if other countries can do it, if they can put forward a report and an implementation review in the matter of a year plus, then we should be able to do something similar if we get our collective minds and political energies behind it. And the third reason is the substance of the conclusions, recommendations, and insights that these other countries and jurisdictions have developed, which in many respects, as I've illustrated, are actually helpful to this committee. It could accelerate our thought process, especially with the tight timeline remaining now, to see what came forward elsewhere, and particularly in the UK, with whom we have close alliances and operational alliances as well, and as I'm hoping to submit later on, also the case of New Zealand. But Madam Chair, I would like to take the committee through some of the insights from this review of the Wixton Report, which was published in 2020, just about a year ago, and it was commissioned by the Right Honourable Ben Wallace, MP, Secretary of State for Defence. And Secretary Wallace writes that today's armed forces, this is in the UK, are very different from the ones I served in 30 years ago. They are more diverse, more tolerant, and more professional. But as Air Chief Marshal Wixton's 2019 review found, defense still has a long way to go if we're to become a truly diverse and inclusive organization. So 1 year from the publication of the Wixton review, I asked Anuta Gray to assess what progress was being made. Her findings show that there have been some significant improvements. More people from BAME backgrounds are joining us. Diversity task forces have been set up. Policies to tackle ignorance have been tightened. But the report also shows some attitudes within defense that remain stubbornly out of step with the values and standards expected of a modern employer. Things must change quickly. We must rid our ranks of any prejudice that besmirches our reputation. We must ensure a zero tolerance policy towards unacceptable behavior, and we must improve our training, our education, and our communication. Above all, we must make defense a more welcoming environment to everyone, whatever their gender, religion, or background. And that's why I've accepted the excellent recommendations in full. So the top level message from the UK experience is the Wixton report outlined, summarized the nature of the problem, made recommendations. The government committed to an implementation process, and then on its heels immediately a review process that we can now benefit from and take note of. With respect to the UK's approach to implementing its report, the Wixton review highlighted that culture change would be necessary, requiring authentic leadership, relentless engagement, and consistent communication. The recommendations were accepted in full by the then Secretary of State, the Right Honourable Penny Mordaunt MP, and published in July 2019. Following the acceptance of the recommendations, work began to establish a central team which became known as the Wixton Review Implementation Team, or RIT, situated in the CDP area, that is the Chief of Defense People's area, under the Civilian HR Director. It used existing resource primarily from Civilian HR Directorates with one post provided by the Royal Air Force. The RIT team was in place by October 2019. So very quick, expeditious action by the United Kingdom, recognizing the nature of the problem, moving forward with implementation and a review. The review took account of the COVID impact. It also referred to re-energized momentum with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement, and this may be important for consideration to members of this committee. The UK concluded that the Black Lives Matter movement sparked protests and a national debate in the UK about racism. During this period, one of the regular defence all-staff calls was dedicated to a discussion on race. This discussion not only enabled personnel within defence from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds to share their lived experience, but it also revealed attitudes, which the Permanent Secretary confirmed, that have no place in defence. The strong sense of feeling about the urgent need for defence to make further progress, both on improving diversity as well as changing culture and behaviour, led to additional momentum and energy to bring about change. The Chief's statement of commitment issued in July 2020 set out bold changes which built on the Wixton review and are an important signal of intent by senior leaders to change culture in defence. In July 2020, the one-year anniversary of publishing the Wixton Review was used to continue the debate on culture change. A further all-staff dial-in highlighted progress by announcing updated policy, new training opportunities, the launch of a whole force bullying, harassment, and discrimination helpline. And I put this to the committee, Madam Chair, in light of the work that I'd referred to earlier on equity and diversity and inclusion, that the 42nd part, this committee and the 42nd Parliament undertook the explicit linkage that the UK has made with respect to the broader issue of diversity and inclusion to the issue of inappropriate behaviours primarily directed against women is an important one, and one that is also worthy of our contemplation and potential action. With respect to complexity of the issue, the UK acknowledged that implementation has not been without challenge. The pace at which recommendations were initially implemented was slower than expected due to issues with allocation of responsibility and resourcing. Whilst there are a range of explanatory factors to consider, there was a noticeable shift in momentum from the summer of 2020. At the same time as implementing the Wixton recommendations, broader transformation programs are underway within the single services and within head office. These all recognize people as a crucial component and are therefore closely tied to progress on reducing unacceptable behavior and creating an inclusive environment where everyone can excel. The different programs have entailed a variety of approaches and timelines linked into Wixton implementation work. The report then goes on to review the progress assessment made or conducted in the UK. It refers to training, including the importance of external third-party training. Bystander training was also raised as a very important point. It refers to policy, making a number of recommendations. It also refers to management information, communication, and, Madam Chair, very importantly, leadership. And on the point of leadership in particular, the report states that immediate steps were taken to appoint a Ministry of Defence Senior Responsible Officer, or SRO, with CPD fulfilling the role. The Single Services and UK Stratcom have also appointed SROs fulfilled by the Principal Personnel Officers in the Army, Royal Air Force, and UK Stratcom, and in the Royal Navy by the Director for People and Training. Boards now include culture and behaviours as a standing item owned by single executive owners. Some single service UK Stratcom non-executive directors reflected that further considerations about the Wixton Review and unacceptable behaviours would be welcome. The Royal Air Force have created a subcommittee on their board chaired by one of the NEDs to oversee Wixton implementation. Within head office, this is considered at the head office management board, and the single executive owner is MOD's chief operating officer. So some very expeditious structural changes in response to the Wixton report and the insights gained from the implementation review. Important for us to consider, especially in light of the minister's statement repeatedly that the time for patience is over and that the door is open for ideas on a complete culture change in the Canadian Armed Forces. Madam Chair, I won't take the committee through all the recommendations that the implementation review has conducted. There's a section titled Looking to the Future. It's important to note that it accepted, as I've stated, the Wixton implementations recommendations in full, and that is extremely important in light of the commitment to Madam Justice Arbour's work here. Getting good recommendations is not meaningful if the government does not commit to implementing them, accepting them, and carrying forward the implementation process. So in the UK, they've done just that. They've implemented and accepted all of the Wixton recommendations, but the review also led to a number of additional ones. It's very important that when one conducts a review process and finds out that certain recommendations don't quite hit the mark or fail to deliver the result that they were intended to achieve, that additional recommendations are put forward and then also accepted. So just some of the recommendations that were made in addition to the ones that I've highlighted over previous interventions. On training and education, for example, an additional recommendation is to provide a service readily available to inexperienced leaders to provide advice about dealing with unacceptable behaviors. This is an issue that affects, in our estimation from the testimony we've heard, senior ranks. It's an asymmetry with respect to senior officers in the reporting line, and to give new leaders, inexperienced leaders, people that are coming up the chain, the resources to deal with unacceptable, inappropriate behavior is absolutely crucial to making sure that the problem actually is solved. Other recommendations with respect to the complaints process, new recommendations are the embedding of targets and commitments into the defense plan, aligning objectives throughout the organization, and tracking progress up to the defense board level. Adequate resourcing for this work, including to deliver the recommendations made here, increasing best practices, sharing across the organization, and considering user-friendly feedback and finalizing changes to the service complaints system. These, Madam Chair, are also new recommendations. So it's important that not only the UK was mindful of the time frame required to solve the problem as expeditiously as possible, it came out with a report, it committed to implementation of the original recommendations, it then conducted a review within a year, and very importantly on substance, committed to making additional recommendations to fine-tune the first set that were put forward in Wixton. This is an approach, Madam Chair, that is proven. It is working in the UK under tight time frames. I call on my colleagues to consider that we need to do something very similar in Canada under very similar timeframes to make sure that we solve a problem that is pervasive across so many militaries around the world with whom we work closely. Again, it is a moral issue. It is simply wrong to have this behavior continue, but it is also an operational issue that reduces the effectiveness of our relationships and the way we operationally conduct exercises and important peacekeeping work, be it through NATO, be it through UN peace operations around the world. We must get on top of this problem. We've got examples that are telling us how to do it, including a granularity of recommendations that in some cases could be directly emulatable here in Canada if circumstances are similar. Again, I encourage my colleagues to set partisanship aside to get to the same side of the table in the remaining sessions that we have and to do this really, really important work. Survivors, Madam Chair, deserve nothing less. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Up next, Monsieur Robillard, followed by Monsieur Bassodou-Duval. Go ahead, Mr. Robillard.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, I would like to begin by thanking my colleagues for their colleagues on motion M58 that I presented last Wednesday in the chamber. So the topic was referenced, and I believe that this motion could make a very big difference for our armed forces. I would like to continue along the same lines I did in the past by speaking to Dr. Etchler's report regarding the honor report, where emphasis was put on taking the time to address this issue and taking a historic approach, and I quote, "In Canada, as elsewhere, there's nothing natural in the history of the limited participation of women in the military sphere. Discriminatory policies that disadvantaged women were only challenged as of the 1970s and 80s. Prior to that, the armed forces openly had a gender biased approach that gave men the combatant role and women roles outside of the theater of war. So there were gender differences and inequalities, and emphasizing this was considered important for military efficiency. The history of women in the Canadian Armed Forces go back to 1885 with the Northwest Rebellion, when women began to work as nurses. In World War I, some 2,000 women held nursing positions abroad. And then in the Second World War, close to 58,000 women were in the Canadian Armed Forces. These women were called upon to compensate for the shortage of men, and these women were less well paid compared to men, even if they did the same work. Very few positions were open to them, and they did not receive the same benefits as men at the end of their service. And as Pearson mentioned, World War II established a precedent in terms of the harassment of women in Canadian Armed Forces. Post-war, women were demobilized, and women's enrollment only started up again in the 1950s, but remained limited in terms of number and the type of position open to women. The Canadian Armed Forces continue to be dominated by men and a gender biased culture. Gender discrimination, of course, was not limited to the Canadian Armed Forces, but reflected societal standards worldwide. Mr. Robillard, I do apologize. Would you please raise your microphone slightly? Just a little bit. Go ahead. That's better. Thank you. After the publication of the Royal Commission Inquiry Report on the Status of Women in 1970, there was a renewed awareness to putting an end to gender-based discrimination in the military. Out of the 167 recommendations made by the Commission, 6 were on military policy on women. And the Canadian Human Rights Report and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms further legitimized the women's cause, which was to put an end to discriminatory practices in the Canadian Armed Forces. In 1979, the Canadian Armed Forces carried out a number of tests on mixed groups in operations. So for the Air Force, in 1987, all restrictions were lifted for the participation of women following the aviation tests. And yet the Army and Marine maintained the introduction for women entertaining combat roles. The feminist movement played a key role in questioning the limits to the full participation of women in the military sphere. And the Canadian Status of Women Committee pushed to implement the 167 recommendations of the Royal Commission. Also, the implementation of recommendations. May I please continue? Point of order. I would like the chair to give me the opportunity to explain. Will I interrupt nobody? Madam Chair?
Interruption.
It's a point of order. So go ahead, Mr. Barcelou-Duval, and then back to Mr. Robillard. Go ahead.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've been listening attentively to my colleague MP Robillard's speech, and I'm learning a great deal about the history of women's role in the army, but I don't see any connection, unfortunately, between the history of the involvement in women and the treatment of women over time and the motion which we are debating at this time, which is in regard to a government response. I'm referring to Mr. Bazan's motion. So perhaps an explanation could be given as to the connection between the topics, or we could come back to our debate. Madam Chair, let me repeat for my colleague, if he had followed my intervention last Wednesday in the chamber, he would understand that what I say is in order, and I will continue and ask that I not be interrupted. Thank you. The Canadian Committee on the Status of Women was created to apply the 167 recommendations of the Royal Commission of Inquiry. And NAC also encouraged the implementation of participation of women in the Canadian Armed Forces and took a position by lobbying for the complete integration of women. The CCASF clarified its position, insisting on the fact that it did not encourage the involvement of women in the military, while underscoring that the Canadian Armed Forces should not get an exemption for the Charter. The fight to put an end to discrimination against women was then led by the creation of the Association for Women's Equity in the Canadian Armed Forces in 1985. At that time, the Canadian Armed Forces applied a quota policy, a gender quota policy on the minimum number of men for each military occupation, according to a military ordinance. For the combat role, the proportion of the minimum number of men required was established at 100%, whereas 0% for the dental profession. And this organization stated that women's role in combat was such that mixed units could be a danger. So this gender quota approach was challenged before the Human Rights Tribunal. In 1989, the Gauthier Tribunal of the Canadian Armed Forces ordered the FAC to include women in their organization over the next 10 years. But this approach was resisted, stating that women's role in combat could undermine the performance of units, and they could not take on the physical strain. So there was therefore more and more support in this regard, but the tribunal did not take into account institutional resistance, and the point of putting an emphasis on equality that would strengthen the cohesion, which is essential in the armed forces for operations, is a neutral concept when it comes to gender. The tribunal therefore concluded that there was insufficient risk to justify a policy of general exclusion. After that decision, all of the occupations in the armed forces were open to women, except for some areas that only opened up in 2001, as well as Catholic chaplain. So when you look back at history, the Canadian Armed Forces for a very long time excluded women from a combat role and had them fill other functions. So the higher command in the armed forces was also opposed to women's integration. The approach was explicitly designed as a discriminatory institution when it comes to gender. And this discrimination based on gender was based on the logics of operational efficiencies. However, with pressure applied by a strong feminist movement as well as social and legislative reform, pushed the armed forces towards letting women join combat and leadership roles. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Robillard. And now, Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Thank you, Madam Chair. I took the opportunity to listen to the rest of my colleague's speech, and I still don't see the connection between what he's discussed and the motion. But this is not a point of order. I do want to share what I have to say before this committee. Perhaps the members of the committee read the newspapers or listened to the news this weekend, but I am indignant given that members of the government are filibustering and preventing the work of this committee. General Vance was seen playing golf with two either high level, one commander, and I find that disconcerting. We observe these activities, such as Mr. Vance being free, which is his right, and yet what is underway is a filibuster, and yet I haven't heard a single one of my colleagues refer to this in this committee. So I must say I'm very, very disappointed, very bitter, because it's now been many weeks, in fact, maybe months of filibuster that we have witnessed. Point of order, Madam Chair. Point of order. Mr. Robillard, go ahead. I would like to remind my colleague that he interrupted me earlier when I was in order, but he is not at this time. Thank you, Mr. Robillard.
There is. Back to you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, what I am saying is in order because I'm referring to the filibuster, a filibuster that is blocking the work of this committee. So I don't think that there is anything more that is more in order than what I am addressing. Seems in the government's interest to impede the work of the committee and fostering this impunity we have at this time. And this is all I have to say. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
No, please.
Mr. Bagnall, please.
Sorry, is that myself?
Yes, you're up.
Okay, I thought Mr. Garrison was before me.
It looks like we lost Mr. Garrison.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to compliment, first of all, Mr. Spengeman on his intervention on the suggestions, the brilliant idea of the suggestions from other militaries that have solved these problems, and the fact that they came up, the committees and the reports came up with recommendations that were actually implemented makes it so much better information for us to look at types of recommendations in the time we have available and on a very complex issue. It's always better when someone has tested the water first. And so I'd like to thank Mr. Spengeman for really adding to this committee. And I'd also like to, thank Mr. Baker for his continued emphasis on the survivors. I think that the military can best be improven by listening to their input, taking it seriously, showing that we take it seriously. I can't think that any member of the committee would not want us to do that. And Mr. Robillard for his motion in the House and discussion of the importance of and the history of women in the military, which is so fundamental to coming up with recommendations. I was quite disappointed in Mr. Barcelou-Duval's intervention. I thought that finally, after weeks, as he said, that the Bloc would finally put their attention to the survivors, to the cultural issue which I'm going to speak at length later today, on the cultural issues related to the military, on the fear of reprisals that survivors have. And he did raise an important point about the golf game, which is under investigation now. So, but, he talked about bitter disappointment of weeks and months of filibustering, basically of the opposition by presenting motions that are counterproductive. First of all, for going week after week after week, month after month since February, calling witnesses on an email that was anonymous, that we don't even know what was in. We weren't allowed to know what was in. When we have all these major problems and real life, courageous interveners from victims from the military, from Quebec and the rest of Canada, that we could, that we should be discussing, and the major, very complicated problems that we've brought up a number of times. And then a motion that causes the opposition to continue to have effective filibustering by having an unreasonable motion that any member of parliament that has served on committees would think unreasonable, that you only have 2 minutes. I mean, a serious issue that a survivor from Quebec had brought up, and that if it would or wouldn't be included as a recommendation, that a person would only have 2 minutes to input for or against, or to improve a recommendation on something that would have such a devastating effect on someone's life, is very disappointing. And I was really of the hope that the Bloc would be the first party that would come on side to, ask for the removal of the unproductive recommendations, so that we could get on with the major issues related to culture, related to reprisals, related to the issue of the chain of command. It is really perplexing that that the that the Bloc, the NDP and the Conservatives would not want a government response to help the men and women in the military from the recommendations that we as the committee come up with after so long of looking at and identifying the major problems. I don't think anyone in the opposition would disagree that the major problems are the culture, the fear of reprisals, the chain of command. And so why have we gone to all this work if the Conservatives, the Bloc, and the NDP do not want a response from the government to show the victims that they were actually listened to and to give some moral persuasion on the government to take action on the recommendations that we come up with. I have more to say on that, but I see that Mr. Garrison wants to speak, and I don't want to prevent him the opportunity. I'm not sure where he is in the list, but I have a lot more to say on both on the culture, but also on the just the lack of ability to move forward because of unproductive motions on the table. So I will stop now so that hopefully Mr. Garrison gets a chance to speak, and then I'll come back with my other much longer interventions that I have. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bagnall. And Mr. Garrison, did we lose you on a technical issue? You just disappeared. So.
Yes, Madam Chair, I did email you saying that I was trying to log back in. I suddenly got kicked out.
Okay. Well, I think it's fair then that you can take back your position in the line if it was a technical issue, and so you can go ahead, and then we'll pick up the list from after where you originally were on the list. Is that acceptable?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was kicked off while Mr. Barcelou Duval was speaking, but I do want to talk about how serious I think it is for us to be here discussing these motions given the events over the weekend, because it actually draws a line under what I think is the important difference between the government and opposition members here. The original purpose in my mind, and as was written in the motion for this study, was to look at why there was no action at senior levels to combat sexual misconduct. And I probably should qualify that by saying no effective action. But I think no one on the committee can dispute in a situation while Operation Honor was supposed to be operating that there were more than 500 sexual assaults, a total of more than 700 sexual assaults and sexual harassment claims filed. And so for me, the critical issue here is why this lack of action at senior level. Was this the fault of senior leaders who simply didn't understand this? Was this the fault of a minister or a prime minister who didn't want to take responsibility for this? To me, that's the critical question. And I understand if members of the government don't think that's the important question. But it is hard to sit through more than 40 hours of taking up committee time, reading essentially reports from other jurisdictions and testimony from another committee into the record here. The government members are pretending that the Status of Women Committee is not about to issue a report that does take into account the survivors' testimony and does include, is my understanding, is expected to include most of the recommendations that they have been talking about here. So we have this some failure at senior levels to really fully understand what the issue is here. And I think the golf game over the weekend is a serious indication that that persists. And it persists at two levels. I cannot believe that the acting chief of defense staff is still in office this morning. The group that investigates General Vance reports to him, yet he chose to play golf with him over the weekend. No police chief who played golf with someone being investigated by the department would remain in office.
Point of order?
Would remain in office.
If it's short, go ahead.
Yes, point of order, Madam Chair. It was not the acting chief of defense staff, it was the vice chief of...
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Garrison.
I do apologize for that error. The Vice Chief of Defense Staff, I misspoke. The fact is he's still in office. And what we have is a statement from the minister saying it's being investigated. So I'm extremely disappointed that we didn't have a statement from the minister demanding his removal, his suspension immediately, because the signal this sends to victims throughout the Canadian Armed Forces is that there are a small group of people at the top who simply do not take this seriously and who do not think that victims matter. If you can play golf with a man who's not just being investigated, as one member likes to say, for an email, but for a pattern of accusations that have been made public about sexual misconduct before and while he was Chief of Defense Staff, then we have a very, very serious situation. So the members from the government are taking up the time in the committee. They have effectively prevented us from dealing with the study of mental health in the military before Parliament rises for the summer. They have effectively made sure we're not dealing with the COVID recommendations before we rise for summer. And the reason this motion is in the form that it's in is because of the filibuster that was going on. Why are there suggested time limits? The time limits are there so the Liberals can't do just what they've been doing for the past few weeks, and that is talk endlessly and not allow us to get to a vote. If the motions really are counterproductive, then let them come to a vote and vote against them. And then we'll see what happens. But the Liberals aren't prepared to do that. They're also talking about recommendations and saying, why don't we proceed with the things we all agree on? Well, we don't all agree on what the central purpose of this study is. The central purpose is to get at the question of why General Vance was allowed to stay in office as Chief of Defense Staff for more than 3 years after the Minister of Defense was presented with evidence of sexual misconduct, which he refused to look at. Yes, it's also an important question why General Vance was initially appointed when there were accusations of sexual misconduct at that time. It's these failures to act by senior military and political leaders that have allowed this situation to go on and to continue to go on. And so, again, today, what I would like to have seen is the removal of the Vice Chief of Defense Staff on a temporary basis at least, to send that signal that this kind of behavior, sexual misconduct, is understood, is not condoned, and that the government will act. Unfortunately, once again, we see a failure to act, a statement simply that it's under investigation and will proceed as usual. And so I remain bitterly disappointed about the fate of this committee in this parliament, and bitterly disappointed about the failure of the government to act on sexual misconduct at the highest levels. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Garrison. Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity for a second intervention. And following Mr. Garrison, I think it's quite clear that the motion that's on the floor at the moment is reflective of the fact, or the discussion around it is reflective of the fact that members have a different view of what the work actually is. It's not a 180 degrees opposite view. It is the view that some members think that this is really about one or two key cases and solving them and the accountability that flows from that, and notably the case against the former Chief of Defense Staff, and that is important. But Madam Chair, there are others on the committee who take the view that this is broader. This is about this case, but also about the systemic problem, the cultural problem that permits harmful sexual misconduct to continue at a time where it has been an urgent issue for a number of years now. And I've made the point that the fact that it exists elsewhere amplifies the importance of the work that this committee needs to do, not just to establish accountability on the one case of the former Chief of Defense Staff, but also to make those kinds of recommendations that in other countries are now precipitating the kinds of changes that we need to urgently implement here in Canada. And I've argued that to do that, we need to get to the same side of the table. We need to all be lined up against the problem, focused on the problem, not focused on the politics. And for that reason, I took the view earlier today that this committee really should be seen as a vehicle for a much less partisan discussion than what typically takes place, and in the minds of many, quite appropriately, in the House of Commons. I've outlined 3 reasons earlier, and I'll repeat them just briefly in light of the most recent intervention, why I think it is important that we look at what is going on elsewhere in the world. The first reason is that it really shows us the breadth of the problem as a systemic issue, not just in Canada, but across a number of militaries, including two militaries that I will refer to that we're working extremely closely with. One, the UK, which I've completed interventions on. The other one is New Zealand, which is part of the Five Eyes. And we are engaged very closely on matters of security and defense with New Zealand. New Zealand has done some remarkable work that I will introduce to the committee in a few minutes. The second reason is to encourage members of the committee to move ahead and to get to the same side of the table and to do the work that's been done elsewhere. We can do this in the course of a few minutes by agreeing to let the parliamentary process inside a committee like it's normally structured take its course and to come up with recommendations that are actually helpful and that will move us forward. This is in the collective hands of the committee to achieve as early as right now. And the third reason, Madam Chair, is that the substance of the conclusions, recommendations, insights from our friends and allies are important. And I think colleagues have listened attentively and will realize that the granularity of recommendations, the relevance of recommendations, and also the review processes and tweaking of recommendations inside of very short periods are useful to the committee and are most directly relevant to the discussion that's in front of us. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll take a few moments, if I could, to introduce the work that's been done in New Zealand. In New Zealand also, the work started very recently in 2019. In that year, the Ministry of Defence in New Zealand commissioned an assessment of the New Zealand Defence Forces progress against what they call Operation Respect. We have Operation Honour here in Canada. Operation Respect is a similar program in New Zealand. And there's an exercise to measure how effective the recommendations in that operation were. This was an organization-wide program that was initially introduced to eliminate harmful and inappropriate sexual behaviors in the New Zealand Defence Forces and to improve the culture of dignity and respect. And you'll see in a moment, Madam Chair, why this is so relevant to the work that's been going on in Canada. The New Zealand Defence Forces plan to first focus on creating a new system for responding to inappropriate sexual behavior before taking a proactive and systematic approach to changing its culture. Launched in March 2016 by the then Chief of Defence Force, Lieutenant General Tim Keating, the program was based upon the Canadian Armed Forces approach to addressing the same issue. And the reference implicitly here is that it's related to the Deschamps report, which was brought forward at that time. It is important to note that other Five Eyes nations, including Canada, continue to grapple with the complex and difficult challenge of eliminating inappropriate and harmful sexual behavior in their armed forces. They are also inviting independent reviews and face ongoing scrutiny over their cultural reform efforts. As required by our terms of reference, this is a report of both New Zealand Defence Forces progress against its own action plan and an assessment of whether the work is positioned for future success. We assess the outcomes and impacts of the Operation Respect program through a strong qualitative approach, given the lack of suitably robust quantitative data and baseline measures. From August 2019 to February 2020, we conducted an extensive documentation and data review, made base and camp visits, conducted one-on-one interviews and focus groups, and received written submissions. We also sought the experiences and views of independent and external experts who have led previous and concurrently running reviews of the New Zealand Defence Forces. We spoke to more than 400 past and present members of the NZDF who shared their personal stories and experiences of their lives and careers. NZDF subject matter experts were consulted throughout the review process. And Madam Chair, just a quick interjection here. I said earlier, when we look at policy recommendations and reports and conclusions and reviews thereof, this sometimes takes the form of rather bureaucratic and not necessarily engaging language, but behind every one of these recommendations, there are conversations with victims and survivors in those jurisdictions. So there's an incredibly important human element, as there is in Canada, that is really driving the reform efforts among our allies as much as they're driving our efforts here within this committee at home. To continue, Madam Chair, the report says, we heard that many enlist for the exciting and interesting careers, travel opportunities, professional and leadership development opportunities on offer. Many told us that they've never worked in any other workplace or profession, have had long and satisfying careers, and are proud to be in the service of their country. Unfortunately, some also reported experiencing harmful and inappropriate behaviors, including discrimination, harassment, bullying, or sexual violence. Early in our process, it became substantively clear that while some progress is being made, we identified a number of recurring problematic themes about the real challenges that stand in the way of Operation Respect's success. In particular, we identified 3 fundamental challenges. The first is that there's a lack of transparency and accountability of the New Zealand Defence Force's progress in addressing and preventing the harm that continues to be experienced as a result of sexual violence and/or discrimination, bullying, and harassment. Second, a code of silence prevails, and many personnel will not raise a complaint or report serious issues such as sexual violence because they fear the repercussions and do not trust the New Zealand Defence Force's processes and systems. Third, the culture of military discipline and command makes it difficult for personnel to raise concerns or speak out against the behavior or decisions made by their immediate manager or others more senior in the hierarchy. This report reflects our assessment that unless these challenges are addressed, Operation Respect is not well positioned to succeed in enabling a culture of dignity and respect. And Madam Chair, members of the committee can see how directly relevant these insights and conclusions are and how much they reinforce the assessment of experts and victims who have come before the committee in the past few weeks and months. The report continues to state that it is clear that this work continues to be critical. The risk or costs of not acting are high for the individuals impacted, the teams in which they work, and to the organization's effectiveness and reputation. It is imperative that the New Zealand public has trust in the NZDF, and a measure of that may be that its people work in an internal environment free from unnecessary harm. We commend the New Zealand Defence Force for taking the lead to tackle the problem. They have laid the foundation of a positive and ambitious program of culture change. In 2016, the Sexual Assault Response Team, or SART, was stood up with a 2-track disclosure process. This enabled a victim of sexual assault to confidentially access support services and to do so without notification to command, which would initiate a formal investigation into the incident under the Armed Forces Discipline Act and the Manual of Armed Forces Law, or even without notification to the New Zealand Police. These were both significant steps forward, and along with the Sexual Ethics and Responsible Relationships Training, or SERR, are the most effective elements of Operation Respect. In looking for ways for leadership to build on these important foundations and to tackle the cultural barriers, we came across the 2010 inquiry by Auditor General Lynn Provost into the New Zealand Defence Force payments to officers seconded to the United Nations. It found many of the same cultural issues we evidenced in this report, albeit framed up in a different context with respect to fraud or improperly claiming allowances. The issues around speaking up and its impact on culture was identified as a problem then, meaning this is a legacy issue for leadership. Culture change within organizations is challenging and takes time. In this context, it is essential to hear the voices of the people, even if the messages are hard to hear. Using this knowledge will be vital to the future success of Operation Respect and achieving the kind of organization to which the New Zealand Defence Force aspires. The force itself told us that their traditions, training, and lifestyle builds strong allegiances within tight teams. It also said that in no way does this excuse harmful behaviors. It also helps explain why their people may be unwilling to risk team allegiance by reporting harmful behaviors, thereby placing the magnitude of Operation Respect challenge in context. This also indicates a pressing need for safe, independent channels for people to use that do not compromise this team allegiance. We encourage leadership to take the opportunity presented in the recommendations to build greater trust and a stronger system to deal with complaints of harmful behaviors, and in particular, in dealing with sexual violence. Our conclusions from this process are that the most significant changes to the NZDF could make to build more trust in the organization and its processes and make a difference for its people and the victims of harmful behaviors, in particular in dealing with sexual violence. And they are the following. The first, to be transparent and accountable by engaging independent oversight and monitoring of progress by a trusted body or entity such as the Auditor General. Second, provide a trusted external and independent complaints channel like that offered by the Defence Ombudsman in Australia to receive, investigate, and remedy cases of harmful behavior and sexual violence. Third, to actively promote the Safe to Talk helpline as an external and independent support channel for victims of sexual harm. Fourth, to create a comprehensive and integrated data management system to assess progress against clear outcomes, measures, and report
All
on
right,
complaints.
I'm sorry, Mr. Spengeman, the bells are ringing. And in order to continue, we need unanimous consent to continue. No? Okay.
No.
All right, we do not have
No.
unanimous consent. All right, this meeting is suspended.